I'm going to move to the second issue I was going to talk about, which is language teaching materials. And this is a quote from something I did with John Gray. John Gray and I go way back. He did his PhD with me going back 15 years, 10, 15 years. He published a book in 2010 based on his PhD. His PhD looked at culture. He sort of looked at content, the cultural content in language teaching materials. What he looked at was sort of a global English textbook. Right? But updating that somewhat and taking a slightly different angle on the notion of culture, we might start looking at how issues around political economy come through the material. Right? And further to that, as I'll say in a moment, what kind of people, what is the target person in the book? What kind, you're going to study English, so who will you be when you come out of this as an English speaker? And of course, if you look at the books nowadays, you can see very clearly the kind of people that they have in mind. What we did was we were looking at the notion of working class, and we thought, what's he doing that? Okay. So we were thinking, around these questions. Working class people, do they actually appear in the books? Because at a first glance, they don't. You look at these books nowadays, what John documented in his earlier work was the way there was a shift. And so you had, for example, you had a shift away from local sort of native speaker cultures, right, to something more international. You also had a great deal of diversity, so you have people from all over the world, right? So there's kind of a racial, ethnic diversity that's embedded in the books that didn't exist before. But what do these people do? And they tend to shop a lot, and they tend to be in airports, and they travel, and they're computer savvy, and they're that kind of people, right? So again, they're not sort of working in factories. But we found this thing in a book by Robert O'Neill. I don't know if anybody knows who Robert O'Neill is. Robert O'Neill is actually, he's about 80-something now, but he wrote these Colonel Lessons books, and they were big in the 1970s, particularly in Europe. And it's quite interesting. He's actually from Chicago, but he took on a British accent. He had kind of an RP accent. And I was at a conference once where somebody said, Americans don't use the present perfect. And so he said, he's speaking in RP accent. He said, I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I can assure you that Americans use the present perfect. I thought I would just throw that in. That was my third joke, okay? Anyway. So again, language teaching materials. We find this working class element. If you read this text, it's really, really interesting. Because this is the argument that people in elite positions, what they say about working class people, is it's destiny. They take no responsibility for their lives. And he said, look how unlucky I am, right? And I have to breathe this dirty air. This was 1970, right? You don't find these kinds of texts in books anymore. So now I'm going to take you back in history. You might find it interesting. The Council of Europe came up in some talks I saw yesterday. The Council of Europe work going back to the 70s, and this was the beginnings, at least in the European context, of communicative language teaching. So you had all these scholars looking at different ways of writing a syllabus for language. And of course, you'll all be familiar with the ideas of notions and functions, and then doing sort of thematic units, vocabulary, and of course, methodologically, getting people to speak. That became very important. And I started teaching English in Barcelona in 1979. I didn't know what I was doing. I don't know how many people I damaged irreparably. But in 1981, I did a course with the British Council, and it was a total brainwash of communicative language teaching. I became a warrior for communicative language teaching. And the book I used, this book had come out in the late 70s. It was an experimental book called Strategies, and then they came out with 4 books. But this second one was a classic. I mean, I love that book. And I was teaching a lot of learners that were kind of they weren't beginners, they weren't even false beginners, they were sort of level 2, which was this book, if you like. What's interesting about it, if you go back, recently I've gone back and looked at it, it had characters in it, and it had a guy, and here we have a Canadian alert, a guy from Canada, from Toronto, and he goes to London, and he gets a job in London, he goes there. So the first unit, he's coming in the airport. And they got all the 70s dress as well, so it's really, really, you look at it today, it's really retro and everything. But he comes through and he meets Barbara. Barbara is the boss's daughter. And so they have this whole storyline that goes through. What's interesting, there's one unit where they talk about a strike, and they talk about the strike in a very disparaging way. It's like some nuisance, these guys are striking, what are they doing? But the rest of it's all very middle-class stuff, and Barbara has a shoe store, and there's all this really, it's really, everybody's happy and well, they're happy, they break up in the end, but that's not but it was inevitable. But anyway, but what was interesting about it when you look back at it is already we're having to shift away from the working class element anyway, but it's still a vision of society. It was very much based in Britain. There was no camouflaging that. More recently, and I'm not going to identify this book, and I'm not going to identify the book on the right either. This is, the one on the left is a very famous international English language textbook. And the one on the right is a German book used by one of the people I mentioned earlier who teaches German in Barcelona. I thought it was quite an interesting look at this. You've got the headings. These are the chapter headings. And the German one is, I'm going to say still, because there was a stage you reached where you'd have 10 units or 12 units, and they were like sort of semantic fields or topics. So what you got here is this kind of format. But in the English books, now they've moved to another stage. I mean, what is just imagine about? Well, you might think it's speculative, I suppose. You're speculating. But tell me about it. Get happy? I mean, So it's like kind of new age. This is something that John Gray was talking about. When he first started his research 10 years ago, he was finding all this self-help stuff. He's creeping into the books as well. But this is kind of new, and I hadn't actually tweaked to it until I actually, looked at the book and wrote down, so these are the headings. So you're moving away from topic sequence. So I just thought that was an interesting sort of thing. Like I said, this is part of that whole move away. In actual fact, if you think about it, the move away from the native speaker model and placing it in Britain or the United States means that you take it out of the society. And so you can't really talk about certain things like class relations and that sort of thing, because you've got it out there in the global sphere. You could talk about class relations there, but it just doesn't happen. And so it's kind of an interesting, getting rid of one thing that looked like a good idea to make it more international and more diverse has actually led to total elimination of any kind of talk about inequality, in fact, that sort of thing. So it's maybe interesting in that regard. Now, some of the stuff going on in these books, this is a speaking activity I thought was interesting from the English book. It assumes a lot of things. One thing that people can choose when they retire, and the other one is that they actually can retire with a pension, which is maybe something that might be changing in the future. So we might want to come back in 10 years and see what this activity looks like. You get advertisements. What kind of jobs are there? Cleaner? No. What do we have here? Business journalist. Well, I would like to do that. Master's degree in journalism, 2 years experience in business journalism, fluent in French and German, and if possible, some knowledge of Spanish. Wow. And excellent communication skills. This reminds me of ads in Spain. In Spain, they have this expression, habla idiomas. So he speaks languages. They don't ever say what the languages are. But some politician, that politician, he speaks languages, right? So, anyway, this one is conversation. Right? And what do you do? I'm an interior designer. I decorate people's homes to give them ideas for furniture and lighting. What are you working with? And at the end it says memorize the conversation. And I suppose if you do that enough, you'll become an interior designer. You'll be winning. Then they do. Here's the working class one. The cowboy in the sky. Anyway. So what's interesting about this is this guy's an iron worker. So this is a working, this kind of working class job more traditionally. But they dress it up. They talk about generations. Ironwork is a trade that's still handed down from father to son. I'm not saying it's not true. It might be true, and it's actually quite interesting if it is true. But they take the job instead of you don't have, for example, a photograph of Pakistani migrants working in Qatar and falling off buildings and dying. It was a horrible thing. I suggest you look at what's going on in the Gulf states with the treatment of guest workers. And so we don't get into that kind of real world of what construction is actually about, when people die when buildings are built, right? So again, this is in New York, and this guy here, and he looks happy up there. So again, we're not really getting much in the way of that. German alert, here it comes. I had to get some help on this because I don't read German well enough to do this. I'm trusting Barbara. Now Barbara's either been honest and really told me what this says, or she's trying to play a joke on me, but anyway. But what I understand is it starts off with what is unusual. So this is actually an interesting example. I said earlier that the books were in the topic, they have lists of topics. And they're doing a gender issue thing. So I'm wondering if the English books, in a way, kind of moved beyond that, because they've been doing that for a while. But it's like, surprise, surprise, you know, she's a welder and she's a woman. And then it moves very quickly to job opportunities, or how do you find a job. So it's a way into a unit that's about professions. You know? Then you have the types of ads that it has. And I just overlapped this because I couldn't fit it all on there. Actually, I realized there's a visualizer here. I could have, you know, used it anyway. So you get, the one on the left is, you have to help me out, because I wrote it down, I can't read it. Insurance sales on the left. And you have a call center, right, which is interesting, a call center, which is not exactly a high-level job in most places. And then you have working in a hotel. Right, this sort of thing. So again, you have a little bit of that. Maybe German still has the luxury of being closer to society, what I said earlier. Maybe they could have a bit of more variety of jobs than the English language text. The final one is, this is kind of the hipsters, I guess. And this is, these people are, what is it about, Barbara? I'm sorry. It's informal dress, and they work hard, They're hard workers, right? So again, we're getting lots of elements here. I know there's a guy writing a book series I edit with Routledge, which is political economy and looking at materials, and he's drawing on some of the stuff I've done with John Gray. He's looking at Catalan language textbooks, which have only an appeal in a local context. They can't be international because you don't have Catalan as an international language. It's quite interesting because he's found very similar sort of calques of what you find in these other books. So people just sort of, you know, celebrity culture, particular types of jobs and everything else. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Now, dress this up theoretically, we need to go back and look at some key theorists. And of course, we have Howard Becker, we have Michel Foucault. By the way, that's the look I'm going for, but I don't think I get it. And you have Ulrich Beck and Wendy Brown. So I'll just go through some quotes here. And again, this is probably well known to most people, but you have, you know, Becker's famous work on human capital, which has been taken up by, I think, in institutions in general, in education. You know. Actually, when I was hired for my current job, I was told I was human capital, which I didn't know what to make of, but anyway. Foucault, of course, has written, and very famously, the text coming out in 2008 in English, but actually lectures from 1978-79, very, very presciently talking about neoliberalism just when Thatcher was about to come to power in the UK. The interesting thing about this, if you really read Foucault carefully, he's not condemning all of this. So there's a part of the liberal agenda, because he goes back to classical liberalism, not just economic. He's looking at a lot of issues, and he doesn't condemn it. So I mean, you know, he does. He seems to in some ways, but it's not altogether clear what his complete view is on that. But we could talk about that perhaps later. And of course, Ulrich Beck, who died recently, writing about individualization. And so these are all kind of elements that come together, I would argue, in the materials. And further to that, there's another element that's coming up in society, which is the entrepreneur. I found this quote from 1997, another one from 1980 from this author named Kerzner, who's written about the entrepreneur sort of in the business world, right? And I think this is interesting. Have a look at that, if you would. So you get this kind of image of the entrepreneurs like walking around looking for opportunities, you know. And what's interesting about it, he attributes a great deal to sort of innateness. You either have it or you haven't got it. So where does education come into this? Can people be educated to be entrepreneurs? Because certainly this is again back to the illustrious Prime Minister of Spain and some of his ministers, and the inauguration in 2013 of support for entrepreneurs, although nothing's really come of it. But of course, what's come out, you get stories about entrepreneurs, people doing startups, a startup with 3 employees, right? You know, there's nobody opening a factory with 1,000 employees. So again, we're being sold this idea as a way forward. The reason why I think it's relevant is I kind of wonder the kind of direction of the textbooks, which I've been talking about. And so this new way, new citizenship, people call it neoliberal citizenship, as Wendy Brown does. We could call it whatever we want to, but the sort of idea of the ideal citizen will be a go-getter, will be highly individualistic, etc., etc. And just for fun, I had to show you this. This guy is His name is Joseph Achem, and he's from Barcelona. His father, the surname you'll know, his father's from Syria, I think. He's become very famous around Spain because he's a broker, a former broker, and he goes on television and he gives people advice about where to invest. What really galls me about it is he sells himself as like the sort of ultimate in cool. You know, the tattoos. He also is an Ironman, whatever it's called, sort of thing. He does Ironman competitions and all that sort of thing. If you look at this text is like, you know, I gave up my job, but I found something else to do. And he's sort of channeling his energy into physical activity, but also he continues to go on. And lately I've seen him on television because they asked him, what do you think about Podemos? And he just said, this would be a disaster. So the discourse he's delivering is sort of out of sync. And he's 40, he's not that young, but that's what he appeals to. He's appealing to young people. And yet you kind of get this disjuncture, if you like, because he's delivering a very classic, you know, anti-left argument, right? But I thought I'd put that in there because it kind of occurs to me that maybe what these textbooks are about is we're producing a bunch of people like him, maybe, I don't know, who go out in the world and be successful.